Good afternoon or good morning, whichever applies to you. I'm Dr. Neil Drew, a health program specialist here at NINDS. Welcome to this webinar, where we will talk about a new funding opportunity, one that we're pretty excited about. As we get started, I'd like to just go over a few housekeeping items. We are recording this webinar. Afterwards, we will share the recording and the slides with all the registrants. We are taking questions, and you can enter your questions in the chat box at any time. Specific questions about your proposed research may be done on a one-on-one basis with staff at a later time. You can feel free to email us to set that up. Our emails are included in this slide presentation. With that, I'd like to pass this over to Dr. David Jett, Director of the Office of Neural Exposome and Toxicology Research.
Thank you, Neil. Hi, everyone. Welcome to all who have joined our webinar on the NINDS funding opportunity on the role of environmental stress in the health inequities of Alzheimer's disease related dementias. So as he said, I'm Dave Jett. I work here. I'm an office director, neural exposome toxicology. And I'm joined with my partner, Dr. Richard Benson, who's the director of the NINDS Office of Global Health and Health Disparities. So I know this funding announcement is a bit complicated, so we'll go through it and then save some time to try and do our best in answering some of the questions. So let's see if this is looks like it's working. So what's the purpose of this funding opportunity? Well, we want to identify environmental stressors that impact the health inequities in Alzheimer's disease-related dementias. We would like to know more about the mechanistic underpinnings of this stress. The NOFO will support mechanistic, translational, and human subjects, and not human clinical trials, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, to try and understand the relationship between these stressors and the health inequities in ADRD. So we hope that these studies will help identify environmental stressors that are related to the health inequities, and what does it mean? What's the clinical relevance? So ultimately, we'd like to accelerate at least research towards better therapeutic interventions and, just a better quality of life. That's sort of the overall purpose of this. So I know questions about, what exactly are these environmental stressors we're talking about. Here are some, but we're going to have a lot more about this when Dr. Benson takes over. But there's, things like heat and crowding, air pollution, air quality, noise, poverty, crime, violence, and also social stress. And again, we'll talk about this some more. So here are some of the expectations. So we do want studies that are supported by the rigor of the prior research that you can find in peer-reviewed publications, or also from some of your other studies in your lab. So the key here is you need a strong premise for this to make sense, and I think that's probably going to be a big issue when these are reviewed. So make sure you think about that. Let's see, environmental stress. It's really just, these are things that cause a strain on human health. And again, it includes some of the social stress as well. Support research on populations and environments that experience health inequity is a big part of this. And this could be driven by lots of different things, governance, housing, work, school, and again, we'll talk more about this when Richard takes over. Let's see, applications are encouraged to use existing cohorts and databases. We absolutely would like to see that, but it's not required. Multi-exposures, that is, more than one of these environmental stressors is also something that we'd like to see, but are not required. Of course, we would accept research with animal and other models, and to try and look at some of the mechanisms, pathways, and targets that are involved in ADRD associated with environmental stress. So the applications are strongly encouraged to build integrated multidisciplinary teams. And I think that this is pretty obvious. I mean, you want somebody to know about ADRD, you want somebody to know about environmental stress, and you want somebody to know about health inequities. And sometimes, most of the times, you need to have this multidisciplinary team. Okay, so here's some research topics, and there's a couple slides. One is, as we said before, mechanistic and observational studies, this time with ADRD patients and controls, studies that validate these stressors and reveal how they impact health. And again, that's how they impact health and health inequities. Environmental stressors on genetic and epigenetic causes of ADRD health inequities. Relationship between specific stressors and different ADRD phenotypes. That's within or among the ADRDs. In vivo studies, again, in animal models or what have you, that mimic known environmental stressors that impact ADRD health inequities. You can think about things like environmental enrichment, prolonged isolation, things like that, that people use now. Omics are definitely something that we would be interested in, to look at comparisons between ADRD and healthy aged matched controls that live in areas where environmental stress is more prevalent. The role of environmental stress related to COVID. And, there's some work out that has been suggesting that, but that would be something that we'd be interested as well, and how this affects ADRD health inequities. Let's see, stress-related segregation on ADRD, for example, how residential segregation facilitates, and things like green parks and sidewalks and clean air. How does that affect, and what role does that play in these stressors and ADRD? So what do we expect to get from this? Well, obviously we want to identify the environmental stressors that are associated with ADRD, mechanistic insight to see how it works, and what's the biological plausibility of these stressors as really being clinically relevant. Let's see, how are environmental stressors play a role in ADRD-related health inequities. And then, of course, new therapeutic and interventional strategies. Okay, so these are just applications that, this is kind of obvious, but it's applications that are responsive. And of course, those applications would need to be either basic translational or clinical research that studies these ADRD dementias, including FTD, LBD, and VCID, as well as mixed etiology dementia, including clinical Alzheimer's disease. And let's see, impact of environmental stress. Of course, environmental stress across all levels of influence, including personal, community, and societal interactions. And research based on clinical data, human samples, and human subjects, but not on NIH-defined clinical trials. And we've seen that this can be a problem with these kinds of studies. And I'm going to now, let's see, where are we? Okay. I hit the wrong button. Why not? Are responsive. Okay. So these are the ones that are not responsive. These are not responsive to the NOFO. Studies that do not focus on ADRD, environmental stress, and that's obvious. Studies that do not include research on the relationship between environmental stressors and health inequities, ADRD. Studies on NIH-defined clinical trials, and we'll have something on that a little bit as well. And studies on endogenous stress resulting from pre-existing illnesses, like illnesses with a genetic origin, and studies on adverse childhood experiences. And there's several reasons why we decided just to focus on adults, but that's what it is. And its childhood for us is 0 to 17 years, based on the CDC. Also, that are not responsive, as I said, the clinical trials. And Richard, can you sort of give a little bit on this? Because I need a real, Richard is a PhD and an MD, so I need someone with that kind of experience to talk about.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, David. As David mentioned, that this particular NOFO, one of the non-responsive criteria is if someone submits an application that includes a clinical trial. And so we have this slide here in order for people to go to the website and the references that we have here to make sure that their research that they're proposing is not a clinical trial. Sometimes there's a gray area. We actually have a committee here at the NINDS and throughout the NIH that actually reviews studies to make sure or determine if they are or if they are not clinical trials. So again, I just want to stress this particular NOFO, one of the non-responsive criteria is if it's a clinical trial that's submitted. So please go to this website and make sure that you're not proposing a clinical trial.
Right, because it literally will not be reviewed. Okay. Important considerations. So it's important to talk about this. So some of the recent changes at NIH we need to have really look at this. I'd say read the specific notices listed on this on enhancing and implementing rigor and transparency in the NIH-funded research. Pay close attention to describing scientific premise, specifically the quality, including strengths and weaknesses of the data you include in your application. You need to present rigorous experimental design, including the criteria, such as proper statistical analysis, control of bias. You need to address sex as a biological variable. If you can't use both sexes, or you see really no reason to do that, make sure you have a good explanation as to why not. And you can't just say, well, it's too expensive, because that's not going to be acceptable. Let's see. So address the authentication of key agents used in your research, and the emphasis is on key because it doesn't include minor agents and reagents and buffers. And I think lastly, do not use the this happens a lot, do not use the vertebrate animal section for your experimental details. Reviewers are not required to consider this section for that purpose, and this may result in a less enthusiastic review score. So few other things. This preliminary data in the literature should support the hypothesis. You should present significant details to evaluate your approach, not just, it should have enough details to know what you want to do, but not too much where it's just overwhelming. And so you have to sort of balance that out. Ensure your work that meets the goals of the project. Be sure to address interdependence of aims. Your aims, that's always something that reviewers will pay close attention to. Make sure they make sense. Discuss alternative approaches, as everybody knows, and talk about how the team will communicate to make this work. All right, this is just something real quick I just wanted to mention is the comparative toxicogenomic database. It's a tool for possibly identifying relationships between environmental chemical stress and ADRD. And you may find air pollution or water pollution. And if you want to look, this comparative toxicogenomic database, it's enormous, actually. There's thousands of relationships where you can find, what human disease are associated with a gene, and what human disease are associated with a chemical, what genes are. So you have all of these different questions that you can ask with this and get some ideas. So I just wanted to let you know about that. All right, so I will now turn this over to Dr. Richard Benson to talk more about these stressors.
Thank you, Dr. Jett. As part of the strategic planning process for health equity at the NINDS, which we recently completed a 2-year planning process, we created an NINDS social determinants of health framework. The goal of this framework is to contextualize the biological and interpersonal determinants of neurological disease, health, and well-being in relation to upstream factors. So these are some of the things that Dr. Jett has just been talking about. As you can see from this diagram in the dark blue, we have some of the interpersonal factors such as biological determinant, biological conditions, and predisposing conditions that people can have. But then we also have intermediate social status and structural factors that have been understudied as points of intervention in neurological and stroke research. The relationship among these determinants and pathways, linking them to one another, are more complex than what is visualized in this linear model here. Yet the categories of determinants are presented linearly to illustrate the primary ways these factors relate to one another. Each of these factors and topics within the framework reflects potential places to intervene. And the model highlights how factors to the left of the topic shape and have implications on the ones to the right. This framework helps to enhance underlying theory, improve study design, and refine implementation design by highlighting the different levels and scale of causation, by refining the efforts to contextualize the interpretation of these research findings. So we hope that this framework that you will use this when you're thinking through your research and thinking about points of intervention. Next slide. We list here on this slide, again, just to highlight that those factors in the dark blue from the framework, we've highlighted those biological determinants here in the red, that this is not the area of research. We'd like to go beyond the biologic and intrapersonal factors such as individual diseases that people have. And we'd like to look at those other factors, the intrapersonal factors such as physical activity, smoking, diet, the social environment, economic, political environment, and other factors that are listed here on this slide. And just one other thing that I'd like to mention before I hand it back to David, when we talk about populations that experience health disparities, we're sort of focusing on the populations defined by the NIH to experience health disparities, which includes those from certain racial and ethnic minoritized categories. And you can find this on the National Institute of Minority Health Research website. Racial and ethnic groups, social and gender minority groups, people who live in rural areas or from low socioeconomic status. So David, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Yeah, and make sure, I think this is going to be recorded, right? And take a look at this. I think it'd be very helpful. Why is this not? Oh, okay. All right, so we're actually almost finished. It's just the dates. November is a receipt date, review in March, award in July. It's an R01 budget. Can't go beyond 500K, 500,000 K per project period. And you can't go more than 5 years. And right now, there's no renewals, at least right now. We'll see. It's a one-shot kind of thing. That it? Okay, I think, yeah, that's it. We've already had, you can see doctors, me, Vincent, and Dr. Drew. You can always reach out to us if you have questions, and we'll be happy to, set up a short meeting to talk about your ideas as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Drew to see about questions. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Dave and Richard. We're just starting to get some questions into the chat now. I encourage everyone to keep them coming. Yes, as Claudia put in the chat, the slides and the recording will be available afterwards. We once these are ready, we will email everyone letting them know how to access these. Okay, so we have one question so far. Are there any requirements in terms of the applicant, I guess their eligibility? So for example, from particular countries, or do they have to have certain affiliations?
No, there's no specific things that I can think of. It's open to everyone, as long as you can you have the and if you're talking about, do you need to be in academia or things like that, I think just if you look at the eligibility section on our NOFO, you'll see the thing, what's eligible and what's not eligible. But as far as I can say, there's no specific kind of things that would not allow you to apply for this. But, yeah,
Okay,
that section.
great. Okay, so we can go. So the next question is there an estimate about how many grants will be funded, or how many what's like the total allocation for this NOFO?
Yeah, I can tell you what I hope. It really just depends on how many how many applications we get, and how many have good enough scores. That's basically what, it's usually the case. In terms of the amounts of funds available, that's kind of tricky. And from my experience so far, it's been just, the grants that look like they have great best enough scores, they get funded. So.
Okay. So the next question is if you can clarify the budget limits. It sounded like you said less than $500,000, and these are 5-year projects. So would that come out to like 100,000 a year? And I can go ahead and answer that.
No.
It's
go ahead.
up to $500,000 in direct costs per year.
Per year.
For 5 years. So so that's that. Okay, so the next question is if this is a multi-PI mechanism, and then if so, does it have a minimum number of participating PIs?
No, I mean, you don't have to have that. We recommend that you have all different people with different expertise, but yeah, it's not a quote unquote multi-PI NOFO.
Yeah, we're leaving that to the investigators.
Right.
Okay, so I'll read the next question. That is, could you clarify the aspects of ADRD that are responsive to this funding opportunity? For example, is it required that dementias be classified by type or pathologic contributors, or are applications about all-cause dementia, are those responsive as well?
Definitely, Dr. Benson.
Yeah, if I can jump in, Dave, at that point. I think Dave listed previously the Alzheimer's disease related dementias on the slide. So those are the related dementias. But when we think in terms of clinical dementia or clinically diagnosed Alzheimer's disease, that's separate, because we know that most dementia is sort of the mixed pattern, which includes people who have Alzheimer's pathology as well as vascular pathology, but they're diagnosed clinically, meaning that they don't have the pathologic diagnosis and oftentimes don't have the imaging diagnosis to make it a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Those would be included if it's just a clinical diagnosis without the pathological diagnosis. So someone who presents and is diagnosed with clinically with Alzheimer's disease without having that pathology, then that would be included. Let me know if you need. Okay, very good. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. I also would like to highlight that Dr. Sharice Shankar has put into the chat a link to the NINDS Social Determinants of Health framework. So that can be useful to look at. I'm trying to see if there are any other questions. I don't see any right now. So, I mean, if you're waiting in the room for someone and hoping that they're going to ask your question, I'm going to venture that they're not going to ask your question. So this is your chance to ask your question. If it makes it easier, you're welcome to, raise your hand. You can unmute and ask your question instead of having to worry about typing in. Oh, okay, one's come in. They're asking if they can submit preclinical Alzheimer's disease related research.
Could you explain that more? Do you mean a basic science project? Is that what you're asking, or a basic project or basic model? Yeah, so I think Dr. Jett mentioned as well that this does, if you have an animal model of Alzheimer's disease that relates to stress, then that would be applicable as well.
Okay.
Quick question about the next one.
I think that in general, if there is a, well, David's checking to see if we put that there. I think at any time, if you have a question about the project, feel free to email any of us on the slides and we can, to let us know that you're going to submit the application. Usually letters of intents are not required. And so if you have your project and you're sure that you're fitting all of the inclusion criteria, then you can submit. But please feel free to let us know if you are going to submit an application.
Right, and I would say, yeah, I don't see letter, I usually have them on all of mine, but I don't really see that here. But I would say better than a letter of intent. Call us. Let's have a chat and talk about it. Or email us, we can set something up and talk about it.
Sure. I'll just follow up on. So in the NOFO in section at the top of section 4 is where it talks about the letters of intent. It's not required. You can send it in, but definitely it's way better to if you want to talk about a plan, you can. We can set up a meeting. Okay.
Right. It's at the bottom of the page. I missed it.
There's one more question. I think that this goes back to, so first of all, you can, I don't know exactly how to say your name, but Ida, you can, if you want to unmute and ask your question, that's totally fine.
I think it would be helpful if you could clarify, because our definition of stress is very wide. So maybe if you want to clarify what you're considering, Ida.
Well, I can say that the answer is yes. That this is about stress. The key components you have to have in this is stress that is that you're making a case that this stress is not causing but related to the ADRD and the why the ADRD needs to there's a difference between people that are exposed to one thing versus another, or preferably nothing. So it's the health inequities, ADRD, and stress. Those are the three things you need.
Okay, and then Ida, I see that, okay, you've written in the chat that you don't have a microphone. If you continue to have questions about this, I would encourage you to email us. We can set up a time to talk specifically about what you're thinking of proposing. So we'll go on to, so there's a couple more questions that have come in, so that's great. You can definitely keep them coming. So the next question is if you can say something about the stages of the application process.
You mean the review of the application? Maybe you want to take that, Neil?
Well, what I can say is that, the submission date is coming up as November 1st. It's then going to go to peer review we don't know exactly when, but in the spring of 2024. And then it will go for council approval, May 2024 council, and projects will probably start in, I would say late June or early July at the earliest. That would be the application process. So you have a couple months before the receipt date, to kind of build your applications and form your teams and stuff like that. And certainly enough time to contact us if you need to talk about what your research plan is. If we didn't answer your question, you can either type it again or you can unmute and go ahead and ask it. In the meantime, we'll go on to the next question. And I'm going to just read this one. If there is no active observational human subject component to the project, is that okay for this opportunity? As long as there is deep investigation of human samples supported by, you know, for example, RNA-seq or some other molecular analysis. So if there's that deep investigation of human samples, that's supported by mechanistic animal in vivo work.
All right, so this is the question I've been thinking about a lot too. So it's a great question. I'm going to start with not an answer. I'm going to start with, we're going to have some understanding with reviewers about this. Now, I'll say that as a start. Now, in my mind, the answer is, and in this, you said active observational human study. Well, I can say this, that if there's data already, not an active study, but there's data already that there is something going on, and we need to see the biological plausibility of we see in these 2 or 3 or 4 papers, where it looks like this, you know, air pollution is causing, you know, much more ADRD when, you know, there's stress from heat or something like that, you know, then yeah, I think that would be fine. Now, if you're saying that there's no data at all, that this has an effect in humans, that's going to be, and you just want to do mechanistic study, right? That's going to be a harder sell. Is it a sell at all? Like I said, I go back to my first thing where we're going to have to think about that. And I would advise you to, let's have a chat on that. And I can do some more, you know, talking to other folks about whether or not we would want to go that route. So I'll stop there. So give me a call, we'll talk about it.
Okay, we're once again down to our last question, but you could feel free to keep asking. So what's currently the last question is, what are the expectations regarding preliminary data?
I don't want to hog the
Well, I would just say, no, thank you. You're doing a great job. I would say that you need enough data to support the premise of the research that you're proposing. So, and I think that was in one of the slides that David presented as well. So you want to make sure that there's foundational data. We want to make sure that this, we have the framework there because we are looking at these other factors, and we do hope to see interventions, not interventions, studies related to understanding some of these other factors beyond the individual. But we'd like it to be based upon some theory and some baseline information. So I think you have to sort of consider, you know, when you're writing the application, am I providing enough foundation for reviewers to understand where I'm going with this research project? Not that something you thought of that you want to do and there's no research supporting that. Hopefully that answers your question. If you want more explanation, then you can come off mic and let me know. Come off mute and let me know. Dr. Heck.
Yes, hi, thank you.
Okay.
Yes, so thank you for your answer. So the way that you just described it, so there's, of course, you need a foundation that what you're proposing is based on existing evidence that there is a link between the environmental stressor. But I wonder how much this is, given the short deadline, how much this is an exploratory project with rather limited amounts, or is this more like an R01 type expectation of preliminary data created in the lab that proposes the research?
Yeah. Yeah,
And
it's definitely an R01. It's definitely an R01, and Yes, we're kind of late. I mean, I wish we had more time, but based on the funds we have for this, we don't. And it's hard to, I mean, what would you say in an application? I mean, you can say, you can't really say, well, I haven't had enough time, so ignore the fact that we don't have enough. You can't do that. So what do you say? I think that the best thing to do is just have really strong data from the existing, what's out there right now, and then maybe some data, either work that you've done. It'll be very hard to do work from now until October, but something to show that it's not, you're not just reading something and saying, okay, I want to do this. You're reading something and you've done something related to that. So you have that expertise. And that's really, I mean, I understand your question and it's a hard one to answer. But that's what I'm thinking. I mean, preliminary data could just be, you can show you know how to do this stuff. Doesn't have to be what this is, but you know how to do it.
And just to add, I think that was a great answer, David, but I would also just say that if you can think in terms of translating projects. So let's say some work has been done in an animal model and you want to translate that, and that can be foundational work. Or if work has been done in another area that you'd like to implement here in this setting, that's something else. And you just described that foundational work, but at least describe some type of foundational work, but that is a difficult point. And so I would, if you'd like to send your ideas or specific aims to that, we'll be open to discussing it further with you.
Okay. Okay, those are the questions that we have in the chat. I don't know if anyone has one last one that they want to ask. There was, there is one comment that's in the chat, and I'm not sure that I fully understand what is intended. So it's one of the participants in this webinar has shared that I think a journal article describing a patient cohort. It seems like there's the interest in the people between the people who run that cohort with forming collaboration. So if you are interested, it's potentially you can look at this paper or and contact the authors and go from there. Okay, so that I'm trying to see now if anyone has their hands up or something. Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for their attention and interest in coming to this webinar. I want to thank Dr. Benson and Dr. Jett for their time, and we look forward to your applications. Once again, I'll be sharing the recording and the slides with everyone.
Yes, thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you all.
And again, feel free to reach out.